Now that I got your attention, welcome to our video about how to write your DBQ, your modified DBQ for the 2020 APUSH exam. This is going to be a short video because today, as it says in your calendar, we're just going to go through the introduction, and the introduction hasn't changed. So we just have to go over things we've already kind of discussed, but I want to show you a sample DBQ that we're going to be working on basically the rest of our little Thursday lessons here on how to write the DBQ using a period 3 question. And so we're going to get right into it. So I'm going to start talking. You don't have to look at my hideous face anymore. I'm going to jump to a picture of a document that has the question and a sample first paragraph. So without further ado, so here we have it, our sample DBQ question. It's there at the top in bold, along with a kind of an explanation or a thought process on how to get started here beneath it in italices. So the question is, evaluate the extent of change in ideas about American independence from 1763 to 1783. Now, this is a question that gets right to the heart of Jordan's question that she put in her DBQ Q&A that was posted on Tuesday, where she asked about what does it mean the extent. Well, in this case, if you look at the italices, but basically what they're asking is, in other words, how much or how drastically did ideas change about American independence? So here you're not necessarily making an argument yes or no. Instead, you are giving a kind of a spectrum argument. How much did ideas change? Did they change a little? Did they change a lot? Was it drastic? Was it slight? So you get to choose the adjective with which you want to describe how much these ideas changed during 1763 to 1783. Now, an important point here. Make sure that your answer falls within that period of time, 1763 to 1783, those 20 years. So what do we need to know about those 20 years? Well, in 1763, that's the end of the French and Indian War, and 1783 is the end of the American Revolution. So during that period of time, how did ideas about American independence change? Well, I think it would be hard to say otherwise, that they changed pretty drastically. So if you look down below, you'll see my response broken up into two parts. The red is the contextualization, which you have to do in your intro paragraph, and the blue is our thesis. So let's take a closer look at that. So you'll notice in the red is my contextualization, and I start with the French and Indian War. How do you not start with that? So I'll read it to you and give little comments as I go. I begin, the British victory in the French and Indian War of 1754 to 1763 came at a cost to British colonial relations. While the victory left Great Britain the sole colonial power along the Atlantic coast, it also left them with a great financial burden to protect and manage those colonies. The war also created a more unified sense of culture, purpose, and economy within the colonies apart from their ties to Great Britain. As the war came to a close, victory did more to divide the colonies from England than it did to bring them together. Now you'll notice here that I have some big ideas, but none of them are really like outside evidence. There's no really specific historical data here. It's more just kind of big ideas. That's the idea of contextualization. But at the same time, you'll see when I get into the blue part in the thesis that it does a good job of setting up and kind of establishing what my argument is going to be, that, surprise, surprise, there is a drastic change in American ideas about independence. The reason I chose these three kind of points, the idea that the war left Great Britain victor, but it also left them with a burden, is important to when we see why so many of the legislation passed by Parliament goes on to tax the Americans, and that's going to be probably most likely a part of our argument as evidence. It also created a more unified sense of culture and purpose within the colonies, where before they were very separate. Now they come together, and there's all sorts of pieces of evidence we can use to describe this, leading up to things like the Albany Plan and the rest. And then lastly, my assertion that it did more to divide the colonies from England than it did to bring them together shows that eventually the Americans themselves will create their own culture, society, and ideas of how they want to govern themselves. So these are all just clues, they're hints, they're foreshadowing to more detailed discussions later within my essay. So moving on to the blue, this is my thesis here. I use an although statement, much like I suggested when you did your DBQ breakdown. So I'll begin. Although most Americans were proud and loyal British citizens following the French and Indian War, they eventually became ardent supporters of national independence in the years between 1763 and 1783. Now, the word ardent here tells the extent to which I, as the writer of this essay, believe ideas of American independence changed. Ardent means strong. You could use that word as well. But you know I love my $10 words. So ardent would be the word I chose, that they became adamant about it. They felt very strongly about changing their circumstances and their relationship with Great Britain as they eventually will fight a war for independence. After that 1783 portion, you'll see I start my because statement. This gives the outline to what my essay is going to be with 3 assertions. The first of which is because they felt that the end of salutary neglect had left the colonies worse off. This plays to the idea that for the most part, the Great Britain had just kind of left the colonies alone. And now that they needed colonial taxes to pay for the war and for managing the frontier and protecting the American colonies from the Indians and the French and the like, that they started to use the colonies as a source of revenue, and salutary neglect ended, which the Americans had kind of liked. So they felt worse off after that had ended. The second, they resented their positions as secondary citizens under new legislation, ties exactly to all the pieces of legislation that Great Britain passes to tax the colonies. Things like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, things like the Quartering Act, all of those pieces of legislation that Parliament passes that the Americans protest, and things like the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre and the Committee of Correspondence, all those events are tied to this secondary British citizen class that they felt that they were being treated as by the British. And lastly, they had a growing sense of American individualism and pride after the War of Independence. How could they not, right? They had fought a war. They had defeated the greatest power on the face of the planet. That idea and the fact that they could win gave them the hope and the pride and the confidence that they could create their own government. So I chose that one last because it's last on the list chronologically, and also and it gave sort of the biggest push to get Americans, colonists, to believe they could be actual Americans. So that's my idea of what a first paragraph might look like, along with sort of my justification for it. I hope this proved useful to you. Please think about this when you're thinking about questions and things to talk about on Friday at our Zoom office hours. And until then, stay safe, stay healthy, stay smart, and stay smiling. See you Friday.